Well, happy Friday to everyone, and it's time for me to continue where I left off last time. I was beginning to introduce my viewers to the power of using and developmental perspectives for understanding the dilemmas that confront all of us as we move from having been born to readying ourselves for death. And I focus particularly on the first stage of the family life cycle, the one that Carter and McGoldrick label as leaving home. As I said last time, the beginning of the possibilities of a new family starts with what may be regarded as the death of the old family. One member leaves, and the others then have a entirely different family to live with, reintegrate, put together, and the new person is out on the threshold of struggling with, am I now going to begin the creation of a new family? Is it going to be more than me, or am I just going to live alone for the rest of my life? Uh, I wound up by giving a case illustration. In that handout, one of the important things that needs to be mastered by anybody leaving home, and it's there for therapists to look at and think about, is something called differentiation of self from family of origin. That's one of the things that makes the transition possible. And I categorize that in simple language as moving from being in a dominant and deferent relationship with one's parents to being in a relationship of mutuality, where there's no status differences and things have to be negotiated between equals. And there are no rules and expectations about how this is to be put together, and nobody owes anybody any deference. Uh, Many people never get there in this culture, and some cultures even stress that it's not proper to get there, that one should remain deferent to one's ancestors, one parent generation, until the parents themselves are dead. I don't believe in that theory, but that's okay. I then presented a case illustration of a man who did not begin to liberate himself from his deference to his mother until he was in his late 40s or early 50s. And it came with a great convulsive gasp that I hope I facilitated well. I'm now going to turn to the second lens. That was family life cycle stages. I'm now going to talk about individual life cycle stages a little bit today. So let me see if I can find, I'm going to go to screen sharing and I'm going to try and find my handout. Okay, it's down here. I'll have to look somewhere else. Wow. Here it is. There it is. Individual life cycle stages. Let me play with it. It's much too big. I assume those of you in my audience can see this. Would you put your thumbs up if you can see this? Yes, thank you. And it goes from the bottom to the top. So I have to try and there. We start on the floor here. There are, a little bit of background. This is based very heavily, almost entirely, on the seminal work of Eric Erikson. He was a school teacher who decided that he wanted to learn about psychoanalysis. This was in the 1930s. And he lived in Berlin, so he went. No, he lived in Austria, so he went to the Vienna Psychoanalytic Institute. And since he was interested in children, he studied with Anna Freud, Freud's daughter, who was doing pioneering work on applying psychoanalysis to children. He proved to be such a good learner as he interacted with Anna Freud that she decided she wanted to take him on as a kind of assistant to hers. So she trained him in psychoanalysis, and he spent all his life doing therapy with children and writing about it. He came up with the stages of the individual life cycle. It's in a book of his called Childhood and Society. From his perspective, there were 8 predictable stages that every human being had to go through. And I think he would say that these were universal across all cultures. I have some concern about whether that's a justified assertion or not. But since we live in the United States with a kind of mainstream dominant culture and many, many subcultures, I think it holds up pretty well, at least for anybody who's working in this country. It will probably apply to anybody who shows up for help. Uh, but again, I'm not saying that with a huge degree of, of certainty. Be that as it may, when I was teaching at the California School of Professional Psychology, we had special seminars, special elective seminars that we could teach. And each year there was a list made available to students. They often had an elective emptiness in their schedule, and we polled them about what would they like to have a seminar in. And so one year there were a group of 7 students who said that they would like to have a seminar in Ericksonian theory. And I decided I would teach that because I was fascinated with Erickson. So I would get together with some smart students and we would review Erickson's work, and we were particularly interested because all of us were going to be working with people. We were interested in it not only as a kind of theory of what people have to go through, but was this helpful in trying to do work with people if one was trying to be helpful to people? We decided, we read many of his, we read this book, Childhood and Society, where he sets out the life cycle stages. And we read some of his best known works, his analysis of the life of Gandhi, his analysis of the life of Martin Luther, trying to use his own tools to deepen his understanding of historical figures. And we were arrogant. We thought he was wrong. There weren't just 8 life cycle stages, there were 10 of them. And he missed 2. And so they're here. I'll talk about them. On top of that, when we put it together, we were astonished. We saw something quite beautiful in the arrangement. So the first 5 of Erickson's stages, let's see, can I move it? No, I can't move this to the side. I can only make it bigger and strong and smaller. That's all right. I assume you can see all of it. The first 5 stages I have labeled the era of preparation. What do I mean by this? This is the era where there is a dominant deferent relationship between parents and children. They're still living at home, and parents still have an ongoing responsibility to prepare them for their emancipation and to turn over to them the right to become architects of their own existence. 5 stages take place under the guidance of parents. If parents are wise and performing well at each successive stage, parents are stepping back a little bit, and the children are becoming more and more autonomous as the part of the preparation for leaving home. And finally, you see the arrow goes up from stage 5, the arrow goes off to the left and then starts rising. And now there are 5 more stages that take place in what I have labeled as the era of participation. Now, what's beautiful about this is that each of the upper stages sits atop one of the lower stages. And what I'm saying to anybody following me is we need to try to place the clients who come into our offices. Are they struggling and having trouble navigating through one of the 5 upper stages? Unless you work with children, you're only going to see people, of course, that are navigating still through the younger stages. If they are having trouble in one of the upper stages, the most logical thing to do is turn your attention to what the underlying childhood stage was. It's likely It's like a staircase. Something is rotten in the part of the stairway directly under the part you're looking at. And that's why there's shakiness in the upper story. So your first task is to do repair work with the upper stage. Uh, the other thing then, you also have to ask, is there some difficulty, particularly in the upper stages, with resolving what needed to be resolved at the stage immediately before that one? That's the second place you look. Has something gone off off kilter, was never resolved properly at the immediate preceding stage? So your likely work as a therapist to be first to repair the damage, if there is any, at the underlying stage, and then to move on and to repair damage, if there is any, at the preceding stage. And only then will the issues of the stage that you have noticed be able to be fixed well and come to some kind of helpful fruition, which leads to resolution at the troublesome stage itself. This is like a DNA strand. It turns back on itself at a higher level. And I find it quite beautiful aesthetically. The two stages that we added are the ones that have the black shadow, stippled shadow behind it. In addition to Erickson's original aid, we added, what did I label? Role flexibility versus role rigidity. And we added social engagement versus social isolation. What did I call it? I can't, my glasses are not working well. Social detachment, that's what it is. Social engagement versus social detachment. I need to clean my glasses. I will, in time, be talking about all of these things. I don't want to overwhelm you today and talk about all of them at one time. I only want to talk about a particular one. Stage 5, identity versus role confusion. You'll see in my Ericksonian model that this stage has to be resolved in order for leaving home to take place effectively, to move out physically out of the house and to participate in the next stage, which is the challenge of intimacy versus isolation. So I'm now starting to attach some of Ericksonian theory to the very client I talked about before. It was clear that he had a lot of trouble with intimacy and versus isolation. He was obviously not doing very well. He didn't have a single friend, and the only remaining people who were important to him mainly were his parents. Uh, Clearly, he was having trouble moving along that line to the left and up into the challenges of the next stage. So I won't go back to the foundational stage, trust versus mistrust today, in talking about him because I really don't know much about that stage. It's the stage from about birth to 18 months of age. And I can't tell you, I know nothing about what was happening in his family or what happened to him. But I can talk a lot about the stage identity versus role confusion. Uh, he, I believe, probably had some identity disturbances that I didn't need to pay attention to. But I will use another case today to illustrate the kinds of things that can go off the track in the building of one's identity. I have a chapter out of my book to read about somebody whose leading struggle was a false identity that had been formed during not only in adolescence, but consistently over his entire childhood. He was being scripted and directed into a life that was killing him. And I had to help liberate him from a false identity he had assembled and brought to fruition in late adolescence and early adulthood. So, what is an identity? Freud was known over and over again for the ego, the id, and the superego. Erickson's chief concept he contributed was identity. What the hell did Erickson mean by his concept of identity? Lecturing about this is somewhat difficult because in doing so, I have to tell my listeners that just like Freud's words ego, id, superego changed over the enormity of the number of papers and books he wrote, so did Erickson's concept of identity and what he meant by it keep changing over time as he played with it and learned more. Even though he kept using the same term was being used for slightly different and changing things over the span of his productive life. So I will tell you what I think is the most sensible meaning of what an identity is. And I will use a metaphor. Uh, we crawl on all fours to start with, and eventually we stand erect. And we stand erect and we march out of our parents' home into a new life. And in order to stand erect, we have to have a very well functioning spinal column. So that allows us to stand erect. Identity is the spine, is our spine, and it's composed of many parts. I'll shift images now. Identity is like a cable holding up a bridge. The cable itself is made of interwoven strands before it's strung, and the deck of the bridge and the walkways and the roadways are hung from it. It's on huge cables with many strands in them. So I think that identity, that spine or that bridge cable that we grow for ourselves has 5 different strands in it. I hope I remember them today. I haven't looked at any notes as I got ready to present this. I hope my memory will rescue me and it's not shot. Uh, the first strand in identity, Erickson can be quite poetic. He says we need to have a sense of what he calls historicity. Not our, he didn't say our personal histories, he said historicity, he named it. And that's what he was referring to. Who am I? How did I arrive on earth? Where did I come from? What am I doing here? Uh, and any of us who raise children have interesting experiences. If your children are fairly young in elementary school or maybe on into middle school, if you're having a conversation with you and with them, and they're telling you about something that's troubling them or something that happened, if you may do the dumb thing of saying, "Oh, I can remember when I was in high school or elementary school or middle school at your age, let me tell you what happened to me. It's very much like what happened to you." Their eyes will glaze over. They're not interested in hearing what happened to you. It has no relevance for them. You're a creature of a different generation and a different kind. It's like a hippopotamus talking to a squirrel. What relevance does any of that have for them? However, as they come past puberty and into their growing adolescence, they suddenly get much more interested in what is this family I belong to? How did mom and dad meet? What did they think of each other? What was their courtship like? I have grandparents. Did they come from the old country? Why did they come here? They suddenly draw closer to their grandparents than they've been, and they like hearing stories from their grandparents about what their grandparents' trajectory was through the world, particularly if they're immigrants. Where did they come from? Why were they getting away from there? What was difficult about there? What was it like arriving in the United States? They are beginning to build their sense of historicity. They know something about the interaction of generations before them, what life was like in other places, what people who are a part of their clan were going through. Were they in the ruling class? Were they in a stigmatized class? Was that part of why they came to the United States? These things fascinate them. Adjustment to this country fascinates them. Moves there to live in various parts of the country fascinates them. The courtship of their parents fascinates them. How the parents decided to get married and have children fascinates them. They will listen uninterrupted, except for questions for further clarification, and they are weaving together that strand of their historicity. Now, we have a special disadvantaged class in our country. We have a bunch of children who have been adopted. And up until fairly recently, adoptions were closed. There was no contact with the birth parents after the birth parents gave them up. There was nobody to interview about these things. The adoption entities, the county adoption agency or the private adoption agency, usually had some information. They had interviewed at least the mother about certain things, and or if the father was available, they had interviewed the father. So that file, and it's fairly minimal, that file was turned over to the adoptive parents. Uh, the adoptive parents never talked to the birth parents. They don't know them. They didn't ask their own questions. So the bridge of creating historicity has been partly or almost fully obliterated. And there was no thought of getting in touch with the birth parents until fairly recently in history. So most adoptive parents shared at some point when the kids got older, shared some of the information that they had, or maybe all the information they had, meager as it was, about who their forebears were. Some of them were very jealously protective and didn't want to share those quote secrets. Some of them didn't even tell the children they were adopted. Some of them would tell the kids they were adopted, but they didn't know anything about who their parents really were. All of this creates trouble for adoptive kids. We're moving more fully to having open adoptions where the adoptive parents get to interview and get to know the pregnant young woman, and she gets to know them, and they make a match with each other, and they're even encouraged to keep the adoptive mother who's surrendering the child alive as part of the new family that's been created. So the child who's being adopted could develop his or her relationship with that person. And of course, that opens the possibility of knowing much more about one's path. And I'm a firm believer in open adoptions. I think that does very, very well. So let me tell you this, if you work with adolescents or early adults, early young adults, and they seem lost, they're having trouble leaving home, they're having trouble putting together other parts of their identity, their sexual identity, their occupational identity are two parts where this often manifests itself. Uh, but it can in any of the strands of identity I'll be talking about. It's because the historicity strand has not been forged well enough. And strangely enough, the best therapeutic intervention is to suggest to the child, the client of yours, that it might be helpful for them to go on a search for their birth parents and see if they can unseal records, see if they can hire detectives as necessary to find out who those people were, because those people have important stories, and hearing the stories will help the young person you're struggling with to become more focused in the world and to feel a sense of growing a path forward more richly than they're able to do now. Part of what may be keeping them stuck is this very lack of knowledge about much having to do with their birth parents. I I'm personally invested in this, not just as a therapist, but by the fact that my two children in my first marriage was adopted. And as soon as my daughter turned 6, we instructed her about the fact that she was an adopted child and she was not our biological child. We tried to frame the story in a very positive and helpful way. Her mother wanted her but could not keep her, and that happens to be the truth. We were able to tell her the story of her mother's valiant fight to be able to hold on to her, that was overwhelmed. Mother was just overwhelmed and couldn't continue it, and decided with great lamentations and pain that she had to give up her child. So she had. And we shared with her whatever limited knowledge we had about the circumstances of her birth and who her biological father was. We at least knew his occupation. This was a Vietnam romance that had gone south, and he was a Navy pilot. We knew that, and we told her the story. And starting when she was about 8 or 9, I started asking her because I knew things were loosening some. Did she have any desire to learn more? Was it something she wanted to think about doing to meet her mother sometime? Probably would be harder to meet her father because we didn't know much about him. But would she like to meet her mother? And my daughter would say, "No, I have no desire. You and my mom are my parents, and please, thank you for the offer, but no." When she went into adolescence, I knew she would be starting to work on her identity. I would ask her again, "Have you reconsidered this? I'm still a big fan of it. I would encourage you, and I'll give you whatever help I can to make this happen." No, she still was not interested. The last time I seriously asked her when she was about 16, I asked her again, and this time I asked her why she kept saying no with such insistency. And she said, it seems like not a good risk. I hadn't put myself in her shoes at all. I thought, a risk of what? What is the risk? She said, there are three things that can happen, and two of them would be awful. The pain would be terrible for me. And I said, well, what are the two things? Well, I could find my birth mother and I could try and get in touch with her, and she would reject me all over again. She would say, "Stay away from me. I don't want to have anything to do with you. Just get out of my life. Don't try to get in touch with me again." I can't tell you how much that would hurt. She gave me up once. I don't know if I could stand the pain of now really being given up. You said she had to give me up. If she voluntarily wanted to get rid of me now, that would just feel awful. Well, okay, I understand. I'm sorry I hadn't appreciated that fully. What is the second thing that would go wrong? I'm afraid I would meet her and I would find her disgusting. I am the descendant of a disgusting, odious human being. I would not want to have anything to do with her. I don't know what, she would be from some trailer park in West Virginia and be a drug addict and a child abuser. She would have had another family, and I would have to live knowing I have her genes in me, and I'm descended from somebody whose lifestyle is like that. That would just be unbearable too. Well, what's the third thing that wouldn't be unbearable? That we would meet and we might like each other and we might start having a relationship with each other. The odds seem very, very slim that that would be the outcome, so I don't want to take the chance. I said, okay, I won't nag you anymore. Just know that I'm willing to help if you ever change your mind. Gee, it sounds like I'm telling the story of my younger child more than my client right now. Uh, Well, I think I mentioned at one point that my older son was profoundly developmentally disabled and wound up in a board and care facility, has an IQ in the 60s. Uh, this was very problematic for my daughter. She went to UC Santa Barbara and she majored in two things. She majored in psychology and French. And when she came out of school, she decided that she would go to work at the Devereaux Foundation because she had a psychology major. She wanted to start supporting herself. She wasn't interested in any particular graduate education at that time. She didn't want to become a psychologist, but she would use her psychological knowledge and her practical world knowledge because she had visited her brother many times at the Devereaux Foundation. Could she get a job as a worker with children in the Devereaux Foundation? And they did hire her. She worked there for several years. She decided at some point after being there, let's see, she went to work at 22. When she was about 27, she decided she was getting burned out and things were changing. There were fewer and fewer insurance policies that would pay for somebody being in the Devereaux Foundation open ended. The funding of the Devereaux Foundation was shrinking. They decided they had to do something else. They had to start purchasing and creating group homes rather than having a facility that with many services available. Group homes to warehouse the people who had been Devereaux patients, and that didn't interest her. She didn't want to be a live-in person in a group home. She liked working with the developmentally disabled when she thought she could be helpful. She didn't like warehousing them. She didn't know what the hell she was going to do next. She was very lost about her career. And I could see she was having trouble at stage one prime. She was having trouble building intimate relationships. She was only dating very occasionally. She had a few friends from college that she would hang out with periodically. She seemed not to want to have any intense one on one relationship with somebody. She had gotten steady with one guy who was a married man, so the chances of that developing into more were not very great. She got frustrated with him and kicked him out. And now she was heterosexual. She didn't seem to have any interest in developing any ongoing heterosexual attachment. She dated rarely, once in a great while, and simply relied on a friendship network to have some social events with them. And I was not an expert on how she should live, but it seemed to me she was bent in Erickson's direction towards isolation, and I was not surprised. Clearly, the preceding stage, identity formation, I could already identify was fucked up. And I was tempted to start nagging her over again. Is she sure she didn't want to go for a search of somebody who that person who was her birth mother? No, she didn't. She did come up with a suggestion, though. She thought she needed a timeout. She was going to leave the Devereaux Foundation. She had applied to the Peace Corps, and they had accepted her to go to West Africa, and she was going to go. She was going to take them up on their invitation, and I loved hearing that because part of Ericksonian theory is to take our culture to task. He believes that on that precipice of separating from the family and moving into more independent living, children should not rush to finish their identity formation. They should take what he called a moratorium. They should do something apart from the family that was part way a separation from them, but was not a commitment to what they were going to do as grown-ups yet. He admired certain other cultures. He admired certain Eastern cultures because people were expected to separate from the family and go to the Zen monastery and to do good works, to do social works in the community, and to study Buddhism and to meditate, and to not have to define who they were going to become for at least a year, and not leave the monastery until they had had that moratorium. He liked Native American cultures because at least the braves were expected to go out into the wilderness all by themselves, and they were to stay by themselves, often with the help of some kind of psychedelic medicines, and they were to await a call, a vision. What was to be their place in the tribe when they came back from the moratorium? And the spirits would appear to them, and the spirits would give them a new name and would tell them whether they were going to be spiritual figures, whether they were going to be braves, what they were going to be, what they were going to be farmers, what was to be their specialized position in the tribe. It would be announced to them, and they would be taught what it was. And he liked that. They were not to foreclose themselves too soon. And he liked Israeli culture because everybody went into the military for at least a year or two. And the military re-socialized them, provided them practical tools of self-defense, and spared them from having to declare a destination between 18 and 20. That's when one was in the Israeli military. Spared them from having to declare what their destination was to be beyond that. But we expect kids to start announcing their potential destinations. Are they going to be firemen, space pilots? What are they going to be? We start nagging them about it when they're growing up. What do they think they're going to do when they grow up? We raise that as a topic they should be working on already. and they're expected to go smoothly through one after another. I'm fond of saying from the wealthy, they're to get into good preschools that have a strong acceptance rate at the right private schools, and then do very well so they could get into the right prep schools, and then go to the right colleges, to go to the right graduate schools, so they could get into their proper occupation and have the tools to do that when they finally graduate graduate school. That is the privileged, wealthy pathway. And they're already told what the array of choices are that, as they get older, that they should choose from. And they're fools and idiots and not doing it right if they don't choose from one of those destinations. They get no time out, whatever. And Erickson says one of the reasons for what we call midlife challenges, midlife crises, is because we're forcing people in our culture to make those choices and fix themselves much too early without having experimented with enough and without having tried other things on. And so he suggested this be kept open in some ways in our culture, and we find substitutes for the moratoriums that are already built into the fabric of another culture, and let kids lie fallow and experiment with things and not ask them to fix themselves too quickly. And so they'll suffer, they'll feel lost, they'll feel confused. They'll make choices and the choices don't work out and they have to liquidate them and maybe get help from the family again. But it's okay if they don't come to closure until well into their 30s. It's fine. And people who wait that long and have adventures and try things on and liquidate them again and try something else on are much less likely to have a midlife crisis than people who fix themselves too soon. I think I'm going to spend all my time talking about my daughter. So I was glad she was going off to the Peace Corps. She would be there for a year or two in West Africa, totally out of her culture, in a strange culture, doing some kind of social service for people who weren't even part of her clan. She went to West Africa because where she was, the French was the language of choice, and she was fluent in French. They were very happy to get her. And her assignments were she was going to go to a very rural village that was 5 hours by truck. Truck was the form of transportation over unpaved roads to the destination. There would be a house waiting for her that the Peace Corps had purchased for Peace Corps volunteers to live in. And on her rotation, there had been a very high infant mortality rate in that village. Part of the problem was that they washed clothes, defecated, and took drinking water out of the same section of the river that was there. And the river was probably very contaminated at the locations they were taking water from. And they taught her well how to discover a well and how to build a communal well that would run on solar panels and pump the water out of the ground and be fresh water that was uncontaminated. That was one of her tasks, and the other was to educate the women, to teach them to read and write, because the birth rate went down everywhere in Africa where women started to get educated and can ask questions about how things are done in other cultures. And birth rates declined. Women tried to stay in school longer if they were taught reading and writing. So she was part-time a teacher and part-time a well maker. And it was accepted by the villagers that that's what she would be doing. Magic happened. Sometimes I believe there's a deity. About a month before she was going to leave to show up in Africa, she was walking on the streets of Westwood, where UCLA is situated, and where her family with her mother was situated. And as she came walking down the street, walking in the opposite direction was the social worker who had presided over her adoption to us. We knew the social worker pretty well because, unlike other social workers, She took a personal interest in the families where she had placed families, and she managed to stop by visiting with them at least once a year, seeing how things were going, how the child she had placed for adoption was developing. So my daughter Naomi knew her, and I knew her, and oh, she welcomed Naomi warmer and said, "I'm glad I bumped into you. I was planning on calling you. I'm no longer working at," and she named the agency. She said, "I wrote a book about 3 years ago. I've seen what the experiments that are going forward. I've seen the experiments going forward with open adoptions. I've now interviewed several families that have participated in open adoption and several attorneys whose specialty now is presiding over open adoption. And I tried for the longest time to get my agency to change its policies and begin to experiment itself with what happens if it's shifted over to open adoptions, and it's steadfastly refused. So I am now out as the advocate for open adoption. I go around the country giving lectures on the topic, and I consult with some of the attorneys and I help them, and that's my new career. And by the way, I have committed a felony. She said, I stole a copy of your file, she said to my daughter, before I had to leave, and I copied it. And I know much more about who you are, where you come from, than we told your adoptive parents. And I know the exact names and birth dates and family information about your birth parents. And if you would like to start trying to get in touch with them, I think I could help. And my daughter was reeling. She had to call me. She knew I had been in favor of this. Her mother didn't want her to. Her mother said, "You're right, we're your parents, and you don't need to go mucking around in that." So she called me and said, "What should I do?" And I said, "Are you curious about what's in the file?" She said, "Yes, I'm curious about what's in the file." "Well, you're not taking much risk if you read the file. For Christ's sake, read the file and see what's in it. And we can talk about that before you leave." So she did. She got in touch with the social worker. She got a copy of the file and she read it. And she told me the story of the relationship between her two parents. Uh, her birth mother was a college student at UC Irvine, and her father was stationed for final training at what the hell's the name of that Marine base to the south of Orange County, Camp Pendleton. There's a Marine air base attached to Camp Pendleton, and he was in his final training to be a bomber pilot on the decks of a carrier stationed off the coast of Vietnam. And he had met her. She was volunteering time at the USS. What was the volunteer organization? I forgot the name. Uh, it was civilians who went to entertain and hold dances with and keep company of the so, no people in the military who would be leaving soon. So she had met him. He had been around for a while. She had seen him several times. They started to have a love affair as the desperation of wartime stirs in people often. And he told her how much he loved her. And as the months of his being here unfolded, she got pregnant and she apologized to him. She said they weren't careful enough and she's pregnant. She's going to go have an abortion. She won't burden him. He doesn't need this on his plate. And he confessed his love for her fervently. And he said, "It would help me stay alive if I knew I could marry you." He said, I don't have time to put things in order, but please, I am going to declare you a dependent on my monthly paycheck. Uh, oh, he did marry her. I have this wrong. They had a hastened wartime marriage. So she was married to him. And He said, "I will take care of you. I'll make sure you get a monthly stipend, and please don't abort the child. Knowing I have a child to come home to and a wife to come home to will give me the will to be careful and stay alive, and I will come home to you." And they exchanged letters and correspondence for several months, and the baby was growing. Her parents were appalled that she had gotten pregnant. They were Orthodox Jews, and they were appalled. However, the fact that she had married him and that he was coming home to normalize things made them a little bit more comfortable. In the 7th month of her pregnancy, he was on leave, and she got a long distance phone call from him. And he said, "This takes all my courage. I'm going to destroy you. I'm so sorry. While I was here, I met a Vietnamese woman, and I'm in love with her." And he said, "It was a mistake for me to tell you I would be with you forever. I I am going to be with her. I think she and I are a better fit, particularly after what I've lived through. And I want to bring her to the United States. And as soon as I return, I'm going to start divorce proceedings, and I'm going to marry her when our divorce is final. I will take care of you. I will continue to support you. My wife to be knows you exist and know I have another child. She's very accepting, and there will be no problem. If you don't want me to have anything to do with you and stay away from my child, that will be okay. If you want me to have part of your life and be part of your life, and she'll meet my wife to come, that's fine too. But I just must proceed in this way." And uh, the birth mother was devastated. And she said, "I can't even talk to you. I don't know what to say to you." She talked to her parents, and her parents said, "It's too late to have an abortion." And she said, "You must get rid of that child. You can't be with him. He's divorcing you. He's not going to, you either have to give him the child or give some stranger the child. You have to give the child up." And she said, "No, I want to raise my child. That's my only connection to my former life and to him. I'm going to raise my child." And they threatened her and bullied her and said, "We're not going to support you anymore. We're not going to pay for your college. We're not going to give you money to live on if you're going to do this. We don't approve of it. You're going to do it all on your own." So she decided she would try and be brave, and she would try to have this child by herself. And she kept it for the first 6 weeks, but she came down with pneumonia because they were giving her no help. She had to get food stamps. She had to try and get on relief. She had to try and get a part-time job if she could. She had to try and keep up with her homework because she couldn't do everything. And she knew she would be, the way she was going to be supported, he would have to be in daycare for lots of time, and she would be an absent mother, and some daycare workers were gonna raise her child. And on the balance of things, she was still so angry with the child's father that she wasn't going to hand the child over to a stepmom and the man who had ruined her, that she would just rather start over again and find a loving family who would take her child and raise the child. She would feel better about that. The child was going to get a fresh start with a loving couple who would raise the child. And she had heard that they were going to be put with a psychologist and with a teacher. Obviously, people who had wisdom and cared a lot about children. And she signed the divorce papers and said, I don't want to have anything to do with them. And off she went. And that touched my child's heart. Her mother had loved her. Her mother had tried to hold on to her. Her mother didn't easily surrender her, fought like a demon to keep her. But she didn't know what to do with the information. She said, I have been moved by what I have read. I guess I'm just going to take it with me to Cameroon, where she was going, and I'll sit with it for the next year or two and figure out what to do when I get back. Okay. So I waited for her to return, And part of her identity formation had coalesced. I know now what I would like to do with the rest of my life. I know I studied this as soon as I got back. Google was starting to come into place. I know that USC has a program, a master's program in nonprofit administration. I think that's what I'd like to do. I would like to get an administrative position. I still want to do social good. I'd like to get an administrative position in some organization that does good. I love living in Santa Barbara. If I could find it in Santa Barbara, that would be my ideal job after I get my master's degree. But I have another ideal job. If I could go to work for the UN, one of the branches of the UN that's such a UNESCO, or one of the other branches, the World Health Organization. If I could do something there in an administrative position, I'm fluent in French. I would love to live in Paris. That would be my next adventure, and that's where I would apply for a job. So I told her I was very pleased that part of what she needed to decide and work out for herself was now coming into place, and she was going to get the preparation to do what she was having powerful daydreams about. And I said, I still think there's more that would resolve for you spontaneously in good ways if you made a connection with your birth mother. What do you think of doing about that? She thinks, I am considering it now. She said, let me check if the law has changed. I don't want to get into trouble. If I did find her and find out where she would ask me how I found her. And I don't like lying. I'd have to tell her that the social worker who made her adoption stole a copy of the file and gave it to me. And that's how I found out your name and anything about you. I don't want to get her in trouble, any kind of trouble. So I'm going to see if the law has changed. Is there any way I can legally be put in contact with her? So she took the next step. She called Vista Del Mar. That's the agency that put her out for adoption. She said she was one of the people they had placed for adoption. And she was considering trying to make a search for her birth mother. Has Vista Del Mar changed in any way? Could they be of any help to her in making that search and making the connection? And she said, yes, we're doing some of that now. We do have a program. The state law has changed. It now gives adoption agencies the right to make matches between people who are the birth parents and the birth children. Both parties have to ask and leave letters with us saying that we have permission to match them with the child they gave up. If the child also sends a letter saying they have permission to match them again with the biological parents, if one or another of the biological parents have also sent the letter, they can't tell the person whether the letter is on file unless the match is to be made. And she would have to put a letter in the file to the notifying them she's up for the match, and then wait to hear something from them. So she said, I'm going to do it. I'm going to put the letter in. I don't have to proceed. I'll hear more. I don't know if I'll proceed yet, but I'll take the next step. So she put the letter into file. She was contacted by the social worker in charge of that function and said, thank you for getting in touch with us. I will have to make a file search, and I'll have to read the file and look at it and learn more, and I will get back to you. It's almost Christmas recess, and I'm going to be gone for a long time. So probably after the first of the year, in 3 or 4 weeks, I may get back to you. This was in early December. She had called and filed the letter. She had to get it notarized and all kinds of hoops she had to jump through. There was a form that the agency had too that she had to fill out. She had done all the hoops, and so she wasn't expecting to hear. 24 hours later, she got a call from that social worker. Said, I want to talk to you. She called her back. and said, I was trying to tidy up my desk before I left for the holiday. And one of the folders on my desk, I thought, hey, your name sounded familiar, was from your birth mother. She had filed the paperwork with us just 7 days ago, and it was here waiting when your letter arrived. So I can tell you she wants to explore meeting you too. And yes, if you want to meet each other, we will set up a way to meet. She still lives geographically in the area. It's possible for you to meet in person if you want to. We'll set up a conference call, phone call. If you want me to be present on the phone call, we could do that. If you want me to go to the meeting when you meet each other, you can. If you want to invite other people, we'll negotiate that with each other to see if we can find something that works for all of you. We'll try and help facilitate this meeting in as comfortable and good fashion for you as possible. So I was happy with them and very proud. So I said, so what are you going to do? She said, I think I need to find the courage to do this by myself. I'm still not sure that I'm going to proceed. I have from her her on the file she filled out her current name and address. I know in the file that was here that was turned over to me previously, she had been living with her father and mother, and I have that name and address and a phone number from where her father and mother was. I want to proceed in a sneaky way and protect myself. I said, what's that? I'm going to call what I guess are my maternal grandparents and see if they still live there. And is that phone number still operative? I know my mother's not living there anymore, and I'm going to lie to them. I said, what's the lie? Well, I now know she went to UC Irvine. I'm going to say to the grandma, grandpa that I'm from the alumni office of UC Irvine, and it seems like her daughter seems not to have finished school, or our records are wrong. And I want to give her a pitch about the benefits of joining the Alumni Association. And I want to see if our records are up to date. So they asked a bunch of questions of she said, maybe you can answer some of these questions. Yes, her mother got married again and is divorced. And she retook her maiden name. She's still going under her maiden name. The marriage didn't last very long. She has two half siblings that are living there, and her daughter never finished school. All right, thank you. I'm going to proceed to talk to her. Now she got even more conflicted because she has two half sisters. Is she supposed to have some relationship with those people? What happened to her second marriage? Uh, she didn't ask one question she thought would be very intrusive with the grandparents. Does her mother have any continuing relationship with her biological father? Does she even know where he is or how to get in touch with him? She didn't. She thought that should wait until she talks to her birth mother if she succeeds. So then she did cowardice number two. She called at a time when her mother was likely to be working, and she had a fallback. She was going to hang up if her mother answered, but she hoped that she would get her mother's voicemail, and she would leave a voicemail. First, she would listen to the sound of her mother's voice, and somehow she might hear something reassuring in the sound of her mother's voice. It's like an infant listening to a lullaby. That's what she was going to hear. All this felt very sweet and very touching to me. And maybe she'd leave a message, or maybe she would. So she called and she heard, you're calling the so and so number. This is the residence of her. And she now knew the name of the two daughters who were living there. Obviously, the daughters were still living at home. She sounded very sweet towards the daughters and very pleased to announce the daughters were living there. Her mother sounded like a good human being by whatever silly tests she was giving her. So she did decide to proceed. And I said, so when is that going to happen? And she said, I'm going to want to talk to you right afterwards if I reach her. Probably I should do this in the evening. And when are you going to have free time? When's the next evening you might have time for me to call you? So we worked that out, and I waited by the phone for her phone call. And sure enough, she had called. She said she was going to call at 7 o'clock. At 9 o'clock, I heard from her. And I thought, oh my God, it must have taken her a long time to get in touch with her mother. I'm waiting to hear the story. No, she said, I just got off the phone with the mother. Well, you said you were going to call at 7 o'clock. Was it hard to reach her? No, she picked up the phone right away. And I said, you asked Vista Del Mar to put you in touch with your daughter. I'm your daughter. My name is Naomi Kovacs, and I'm your daughter. And I decided I would be brave and get in touch with you. At that moment, that I'm going to do it too. They both started crying. They couldn't even talk for a while. And her her birth mother confessed to her and said, I never expected I would react this way. I was dreading this. And my daughter said, I was dreading it too. And she said, I didn't want to do this. And she said, well, my daughter said, why are you doing it if you didn't want to do it? Well, I was straight with my two daughters, and I told them that I'd gotten pregnant during the war, and I had had a child, and I'd given the child up for adoption. So as they got older and older into their adolescence, they began to nag me. They didn't like having a sister that they didn't know, and they wanted to meet you. I didn't want to meet you at all, but they kept nagging me and nagging me, and I decided to proceed and file the necessary papers. I was hoping against hope that you wouldn't call me, but you did, and now you're here. And damn it, my other kids are listening to this, and they know I'm talking to you. And they were laughing. She and her daughter were crying, and her daughters were laughing. They were happy. They were joyous that this was taking place. So they didn't get off the phone. They kept talking. They wanted to fill each other in. Why did you decide to call me? My daughter told her many things about herself. What astonished them was how many things they had in common. And astonishes me. They were both fluent in French. Their taste in foods was very similar. Their favorite activity when they weren't sedentary was to travel. They loved traveling to new places. They could well, my daughter could well have been socialized to have the values and beliefs and leisure time interests that her birth mother had. And I would kept saying, what the hell to myself. So she didn't get off the phone until they had exhausted topics to talk about, until they were getting physically exhausted, until she answered the riddle where her father was. My the birth mother had spent time as a stewardess, an airline stewardess, and she had flown on Delta. Delta's home base was in Atlanta, Georgia. So she often went to the employees' cafeteria in the airport while she was stopping over, and uh, 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 non-flying employees were there. Some of the support staff was there. Delta Airlines had a big shipping facility there since it was their hub, and the manager of the shipping of parcels and rerouting parcels was her former husband. He had a war wound. I forgot what it was that incapacitated him for any further flying. But Delta really valued his knowledge of flying and his willingness to do some administrative position for an airline and satisfy himself with that. And he was in charge with of their whole shipping operation. And she had bumped into him on one occasion. He was still married to the Vietnamese woman. He had a new family. Some of her bitterness had evaporated, so she talked to him once in a while. And she said she didn't know how he would respond to a request from my daughter to get in touch with him. But she would pass on the information, and if my daughter wanted to screw up her courage, she was welcome to do so. All right, it seems like it's getting later. I haven't even talked about how she finished the journey, finished filling out her historicity, and what beneficial effects this had for the full development of her identity, which was stunted by the lack of the development of one of the parts. And I better make a note to myself because I haven't talked about what the other four parts are in any detail. And I need to brief you about what all the four are so you can identify deficiencies in one or another of them as causing the lack of full resolution of what an identity is. So I have two things to do to finish my daughter's story and to fully amplify on that stage, identity versus role confusion. And then thirdly, I have a case to identify other kinds of problems with identity formation other than the unusual ones of my daughter, the adopted person. These are more kinds of normative problems you might run into in identity formation if you're a professional and doing work in our field. Whew, I did it. I managed to get through to a reasonable stopping point, and this is where we'll start next time. First, let me stop screen sharing. There. We're gone out of screen sharing. Please unmute myself, and all comments are welcome.
Arthur, you had mentioned that there were three different reactions that the adopted child had. I think that there may be a fourth, and
Good.
I've come across it in terms of when I was working at a child guidance clinic, and there was I think it was like a 17 or 18-year-old adopted son of a family, and he had begun to act out, and he was seen by myself and at the child guidance clinic, and I think what came of that, or what was discovered, is that he was fearful that when he became of age at 18, that he would no longer be wanted by his adopted parents, and so that was a concern that they would fulfill their duties and responsibilities as adopted parents and no longer want him as their son. And that was, always something that he was worried about in terms of growing up.
Oh, thank you. I think that's a fairly rare response too. If anybody adopts children, usually one of two things has gone on. They've either hid, there's a horrible secret there that they're keeping, and the child doesn't know, maybe suspects, but doesn't know for sure whether they're adopted, or they try to manage, I hope, in a kind way, the knowledge of the adoption. And usually, it's to talk about how favored they are, that they were picked specially. The parents had a chance to pick from among many possible children, and they were the one that parents had picked. It isn't like an ordinary pregnancy where nobody has a choice. The child doesn't have any choice into what family they're being born, but the parents have a choice. And of course, they're going to be devoted for the rest of their lives. The child has no fear that the child is going to be given away because it was such a hard job deciding who was the perfect child to come and live with them. That's the kind words that should be said to an adopted child. And there are books to read to small children that are on that topic, by the way. Bedtime stories can be told to them about how children get adopted and why. But I thank you for bringing that up. That is a deviant response, but obviously it's one that should be at least considered as a possibility. Did that kid have bad relationship with his parents? Was the
No,
reason to think he might
actually,
be given away?
Actually, he had a very nice relationship with his parents, but he started acting out, and they were troubled. They were very concerned.
Oh, he was testing. If I get rotten, will you still love me?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Thank you. That's a wonderful example of human madness. And problem solving attempts gone awry. That was attempt on all their parts to solve a problem. The parents clearly didn't get what the message was about. He was testing them to see if they could love him if he was an asshole. And their attempt at dealing with the attempted solution was to send him for somebody else to fix. And he just experienced that partly as a rejection of him. They weren't going to stick around and fix it themselves. Thank you. I will treasure that. It's good to have you guys around.
I guess I just have more of an observation. First off, just what a beautiful story. Yeah, that was very touching.
I agree too,
Yeah.
with Naomi. Wow, what a nice story.
Yeah, it kind of pulls at that. I guess maybe it's more magnified with adopted children, but you see that theme that runs through um, every person, ideally, hopefully, that need to connect with other people and the terror that comes with it, right?
Yes.
And then this time the person has to actually look at this almost primal rejection and risk doing it again.
Yes,
Um,
we all struggle with abandonment fears because we've experienced degrees of them along the path through deaths, through people getting cold, through people just actually abandoning us. And every adopted child has a, you're right, I love that word, has a primordial casting
rejection.
aside to
Mhm.
deal with.
Yeah, yeah. Anyway, yeah, very touching. I think I remember when I was in your class in grad school, you brought up that theme of people's kind of connection and longing for connection, and that fear and terror that comes with it. Because at some level, all relationships end badly. Someone dies, you know.
No, some don't end badly. There are those who say, who get out early while they're still ahead and go on to the next one. But it's true, members of their family are going to die, and members of their friendship network are going to die, some of them before the person is ready to say goodbye to them.
Yeah.
Oh.
Did Naomi have any concerns that you might be affected by, her discovering of her birth
Oh,
mother?
no. Oh, thank you. I will end on this note. She had known all along. She had shared with me every step of the way, and she knew I had been nagging her to do this. She knew I would be delighted. I was crying at her story and telling her how wonderful it was and how proud I was of her that she took the risk. And it's turning into a fairy tale and not a nightmare. And I'm so pleased. And I said, I can't wait to meet your birth mother too. And that's funny, she said, because she wanted to know about my parents. So this is what I had to tell her. I didn't know this yet. She said, as soon as I discovered that you were around and it was possible to meet you, my adoptive mother got very sour. She started saying, "God damn it, I have to share you already at Thanksgiving and Christmas and your birthday. I have to share you with your goddamn father. And now is there going to be another parent I'm going to have to share you with?" It was as if my daughter was a commodity and she was going to lose part of her access to that commodity that was so valuable to her. And I hated her for that. And I said, I won't do that to you. And I'm sorry you have to deal with this with your mother. And she remained sour about it, open-ended, as the new relationships, as what was the family started to get redefined. She was the resentful, bitter person in the family, the new family that was being formed. I never was. So thank you for asking that one too. That's an important part of the story. That's another risk that that the person who is the adopted person has to take. I hadn't even thought of adding that. That's the fifth thing in the risk being run. One of the existing adoptive parents is going to get really sour and make a big ruckus about this.
Mhm, mhm.
Is that the thanks I get for raising or something like that? Oh, yes, I have considered that. I have considered that with those group of adopted kids whose parents have kept the secret. They only discovered the secret inadvertently.
Mm.
They already start dealing with that. They start confronting their parent. You never told me I was adopted. God damn it, you found out. You should never know you're adopted. Now, what the hell's that going to do to your relationship with me? Ah. You know what's wrong with the people, with the world? The people that are in it, not the world.
Hell is others.
On that, oh, wait. Uh, a client sent me, I think I can get it on my phone. A client sent me a saying from whom? Who was it? Here it is. Oh, it was from Will Rogers. That's right. This is a wonderful saying about people from Will Rogers. There are three kinds of people. There are those who learn by reading. Then there are the few who learn by observation. The rest of human beings have to pee on the electric fence for themselves. So I will end on that note today.
All right.
Goodbye.
Okay, all right. Be
I may
well.
be a little under weather next week. I will be in the second day of my second vaccination, and that's supposed
Great.
to be a bitch, but I'll see.
We'll
Okay.
see.
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.